Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're working on a 2009 Honda Civic. An issue that we had is the car not starting intermittently, and so we're going to walk through the steps that we decided to use to diagnose the issue, and I'll show you what parts we're working with and where we got them. Everything that we need to know will be in the video. If you missed anything in the video, you can also look in the description. Before we get started, please take the time to go and subscribe to the channel. Just hit that subscribe button if you want to be notified if I do anything live or add new videos. You can hit the notification bell. So I'll go ahead and get started and show you what we're working with today. This is the starter that I picked up off Amazon. A brand called Iron Tree, has really good reviews on the internet, has good reviews on Amazon, has lots of purchases too. I'm always kind of wary if I see something that only has a few purchases, even if it has high star rating. You don't really know if those reviews were paid for. So this is a direct OEM replacement starter. So the way that the starter works is the starter gets enough power sent from the battery to engage this little impeller here, and that's what actually goes in and catches the back of the motor and turns the motor over at the crank. So there's a couple big bolts on the inside, and I've seen videos where it's harder to get to these, and some people suggest that even the certified mechanics suggest taking the axle out so that you have more room to get to. We're not going to take the axle out because it's not necessary, but you've got a couple big bolts, and then there's some smaller bolts where the wires are actually connected. There's some little clip-on connectors, and there's little hangers that are built onto this. So we've already gotten started and got the car jacked up. So I'll show you where the jack points are on the car for the driver and passenger side, and then we'll show you where the starter is up underneath the car. And one thing we're going to do before we get started is disconnect the negative terminal on the battery, and that just makes it so that when we unhook these wires, we don't have wires coming off the battery that are floating around and might be able to touch the ground, touch metal. So we'll take the negative terminal off, and then we know we're not getting power to the starter. We don't have to worry about those cables as much. You should always be cautious when you're working with the electronics around a car anyway, because you can easily blow a fuse if you accidentally touch power where it's not supposed to be. So that's pretty much the beginning of this job, and like I said, we'll just go over the different sizes of the bolts and what tools we needed to get the connectors off, to get the wires off, but we'll just show you that in the video as we progress. So just stick around and we'll keep moving. So here is the passenger side jack point. There's a metal plate that's under here that kind of stands out by itself. There's this long rail at the bottom of the rocker panel, and then there's this little solid plate that sticks out, and that's where we're putting the jack on. So we jacked it up high enough that we could get underneath here and put jack stands under it. So we've picked this point right here. It's a good solid point next to a there's a big long frame rail that comes under here, so we know we're under a frame rail. We're not just on a little skinny metal plate. This is also where the vehicle can be towed from, so this plate's got to be strong enough to be able to tow the vehicle. So we've got this is the passenger side jack stand, and then we've got the driver side jack stand on the other side is in the exact same spot. So we've got the whole front end jacked up, and the reason is because we have to get to a spot that's up under here. And so there's the factory starter right there. It's got that long metal rod on the back of it. That's the starter. This is probably the factory starter. It's probably never been replaced. So let me go over real quick how we determined that that was the issue. The way that we determined that the issue was the starter on this car, we started with the battery and just checked the voltage. Now the voltage on the battery was a little bit low. You know, it typically sits between 12.5 to 12.7, and we were right at 12.5 with a little bit of the charge. When you turn it over to the accessory position, it seemed to want to go a little bit below 12.5. So this is a battery that you can actually maintain. So you can pop the caps on the battery and you can look down inside and you can actually see the internals of the battery itself, and you can see the water levels. and at least 3 of the ports, the water level was a little bit low. So we took a little measuring cup that had a little spout edge on it and used that to pour distilled water into those ports. Now you want to make sure that you use distilled water. You don't want to use tap water because it has minerals in it. You don't want minerals getting into where the battery, the acid and the chemicals that are inside the battery. You don't want any minerals, particles getting in there. So always use distilled water. So we popped the caps on the battery, top them off, and then set the battery on a trickle charger. And when we came back, the charge was closer to 12.6, and even after turning the key forward past the accessory position and actually went to start the car, the battery voltage didn't drop below like 11.7, and so that's a good sign that the battery is got plenty of charge. We didn't check the cold cranking amps at that point because there's another easy test to do on a starter. I'd actually forgotten about how we used to test starters back in the day, but believe it or not, the easiest way to check a starter to make sure that it's the starter that's bad is to try to start the car. If the car doesn't start, actually go up underneath the car and smack the starter with a hammer. You don't have to smack it so hard that you beat up the housing or break anything, but you just kind of want to tap on it a good bit. And so what I did was I used an extension from a socket wrench and just tapped the end of the extension with the hammer and put the end of the extension up against the starter and tapped it probably about half a dozen times. And the very next time when we went to start it, it actually started. And so the starter has worked since then, since tapping it, but that means that something in the internals is getting a little gummed up and it's not able to turn over. So what we're going to do, what we did then is just go online and do some research, and I went back and forth between the OEM, direct OEM replacement from Honda, OEM from some other retailers, and then different brands of aftermarket. Now the OEM starter for this is about 240 bucks. This is a 2009 Honda Civic. It's got a salvage title for hail damage, so it's not a $10,000 car. There's no reason to dump a ton of money into it for parts. OEM obviously would be best. It's got over 150,000 miles on it, which means the starter's lasted that long. But it was about 240 directly from Honda. I could find places where they had the same OEM direct replacement part for as little as 200 to 210. And then there's some aftermarket brands that have a lot of good reviews. There's an aftermarket brand that is still 200 bucks for the aftermarket one. And then there's some that are really cheap. I mean, they're only like 30 bucks. And so I believe this one was 75 to 85 with tax on Amazon. Like I said, the brand is Iron Tree. It's actually stamped on the body of the starter. And so we've ordered the starter. The starter came in overnight, and now we've got a good day with good weather. We can get under the car and pull the starter out. So we'll get started on getting under there and getting the right tools to take the starter apart and get it out. And we'll just show you what we're taking apart as we go. So looking up underneath from here, what we're looking at is there's the cable, this green cable that's right here. This comes over the top, and there's actually a little tab on the back, and we can just push this off. That's that little bracket that you can see on the starter the way we have it now. And then there's one bolt that's right there at the end of my finger that you can see. It's a pretty big bolt, probably 14 millimeter, I'm guessing. And then there's another one that's on the top side of the starter further up here, and that's where you have to get this clip undone and get this cable out of the way so that you can get to that. You got to get an extension behind here, so it's actually between the back of the intake and the top of the starter is where you have to get in behind here. On the other side of that cable you have to get in to get the top bolt out. And there's only the two big bolts that actually bolt it to the car itself, so there's just some on the end of this cable there's actually a little clamp that comes off the starter that holds that cable on, so we'll have to undo it. And then on the other side of the starter there's some cable connectors that we have to undo. So that's where we're getting started. So as you can see, it was 14 millimeter. Not sure I was having such a hard time focusing. So 14 millimeter. I got a 12-inch extension, and then I've actually got the wrench. If you can see, the wrench is actually in here, like that, off the end. So it's up in this cavity, and you can reach your hand through in between here, and you can actually grab onto the wrench from in there, and that makes it so that you can leverage on that bolt to get that bolt to come undone. So now the bolt's loose on this side. So, and I've already got that cable disconnected up there. You can see that green cable is actually slid off the little hanger that it was on now. Another piece we're going to take off is the 2 bolts that are right there in the middle, side by side. Those are going to come off. There's another one that's right there. It's just that black metal angled plate there is what we're taking off. And so it's easy to get to just straight from up under here. So I'm trying to show you what's up under here. So on the other side of the starter here, you can see my extension is in there, and I've got a swivel head 14 millimeter on the end right there. So that's a swivel head 14. I've got a 6-inch, I think a 6-inch extension. I've just got it back up in this pocket again. So you can see where my socket wrench handle is going that way up there. So there's kind of this nice big pocket up in here behind the motor. So there you can see where those two bolts are missing right there. That's where that plate was. So I got that plate off, and then there's the other hole where that other bolt came out. And then I've got my extension set up through there. And you know what I've seen on is the bolt being back up over here. So that's where that right there is where that other bolt was that I pulled out earlier. And this is just not gonna focus today. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm all the way zoomed out, and it just won't focus on anything. So that bolt hole right there is where that first bolt came out, and it's just a short little bolt. But on the other side, it's like Honda took care of something, or somebody added something, but instead of the bolt being that short, and it's just right here where on the other side of the starter up here, instead of it being on the other side of the starter way up here, on the top end, it's not a short bolt, it's actually this really long bolt, and the long bolt goes from the other side of the starter on the top end all the way out to here, and you can actually see the end of the bolt. It's another 14 millimeter, but it's just this really long extended bolt. So I've already loosened it. I've got it loosened now, but like I said, I had to get the wrench up in this cavity behind the motor here. You can see that long bolt goes all the way to where it bolts the starter into the side of the motor housing, the bell housing, I guess, whatever you call it. And so that's how I got this up in there. So I'm just going to continue undoing that. So if you're wondering the best route to get the starter out, I don't particularly have one. Now I wanted to show you something ingenious that Honda might have done. I'm not sure. It might be an aftermarket part that a technician put in later on and just left. It might be a replacement bolt. I've not seen this before, but I did want to show you what a dirty job this is, and you're gonna get real beat up if you don't have a lift doing this. Even though we've got the jack stands up underneath it, it's still really tight. So I would suggest try to drop about 20 pounds before you do this job, and your big old sausage fingers and your forearms aren't going to get in the way to get in and take these bolts out. It's not easy to get to. There's no way around it. I've heard people say they take the axle out. I'm not going to take the axle out to take the starter out. So the starter is coming out. I've got one more bolt, and I'll show you what that bolt is that I've still got to pull off, and I'll just show you some of the other steps I've taken to try to get it out. So this is how dirty it is up under there, and see the red marks. Gonna get plenty of those. It's even worse over here. This is the hand that's really trying to squeeze in to get around things. But what we're looking at is these brackets are what kind of get in the way. So the starter is sitting where we're looking at it up inside. This is that bottom bolt. That's this bolt. So it's just a short bolt that sits through there. That's a 14 millimeter that you have to take out. And then there's just there's a clip on this, and then there's a clip in here. This one's like one of those push, it's just a push snap clip. This one actually has a little tab you have to push up. That's the green, where that green cable goes across the front. That's what we're looking at. Then there's also, there's a connector right here. That connector, you have to push the top tab in and pull the connector off. And then this is on the, I'm pretty sure that's going to end up being a 12 millimeter bolt. I'm pretty sure that's what's on it. Yeah, so that's a 12. So I don't know what's going on with the camera today. It will not focus on anything. So that's a 12 to take off. And that's where I'm at now. I've got this connector off. I've got these two bolts out, but I wanted to show you. So that was that bolt I was telling you is up on top, and it's kind of at this angle. So you can imagine the intake is up here above it. And you can just barely see this. You would just barely be able to see this bolt, like I said, because if you're thinking that it's the same bolt in the top and bottom, then you would have to have an extension to get far enough back in here and out away from the intake to be able to get it in here to take this off. So what somebody did at some point in time was they came up with this. Now, I'll tell you, I've never seen this style bolt on a vehicle that I've taken anything off of before, but they built the extension into it. So instead of it being a short bolt like this, you know, the end of this isn't even threaded. They actually shaved the threads off on that end just to make it easier to find the hole to get started, because they knew it was a difficult place to get into. So this bolt was the one that's down here on the bottom, and this one's the one that's up on top. So what you ended up seeing in the video was, of course, that cable's coming across here, so it's really hard to see, but this is a 14 millimeter. So both of these are the same, so you don't have to go scrounge around to figure out what the next size is. They're both 14. And so I've got this out. Once I took this out, it loosened the starter enough to kind of come down a little bit to where I could get my thumb on here and get my other hand. Now I've got my hands in, I got my hands in two different cavities inside the car. So I got one thumb on this side holding this tab in. I've got another hand, my other hand coming up through over here to pull at the same time this is being pushed in. Now I've got to take the 12 millimeter on that top, on the bolt that's on there now, and that's what's holding that green cable on. So I've got to take that 12 off. Now when I got this package in the mail, they had the starter wrapped up like this. They had the starter wrapped up inside a box just like this. And so I'm not sure if this tab might have gotten bent down a little bit, but this metal's soft enough we'll just have to manipulate it. Now I'm pretty sure this one has been mashed in. I'm pretty sure that's supposed to go straight up. So where this is pinched together here, this piece right here is actually supposed to be more straight up and down. So I'm gonna have to get something in there. I have to get something in here to bend this back out. Now that's not the fault of the company, other than they didn't package it right. Whoever did this in shipping, you can see where that piece right there is actually bent out. And so this tab is supposed to go straight up and down, and that's what makes it so that little clip, the green clip that's on the cable, can clip onto. It's probably bent in just a little bit this way, and that's bent in, so I'll need something to take and straighten this back out. Pretty sure it's supposed to be more like that, maybe even more. You got to have room for that. You got to have room on the back of this for that connector to fit down in here, so I can still see where this has been out a little bit. So I'll straighten that out, do a little metal work. It's not going to take too long, but that's where we're at right now. And then once we get the 12 undone on the cable and the cable off, I'll pull the old starter out and we'll just take a look at it and then slap the new one in and get everything, just do everything in reverse. So when we put the new one in, we'll just get it set up there, get the cable on, get the connector on, get it a little closer to home, we'll plug that snap connector back in, we'll plug the green cable back on after we get this top bolt started in. That's that long bolt, we'll get that started back in, and then we'll get the bottom one, and I'll have the factory torque specs. We'll get the factory torque specs for these two bolts. This one, you know, is more like just a hand tighten. It's probably going to be somewhere between probably around 15 foot-pounds. These were a little bit tighter to get out. Actually kind of had to bind against my swivel head to get enough torque on this to be able to pop it out. So these might be closer to like 35 maybe, but I'll have all that information as we get started putting this new starter in once we get the old one out. So I figured this would be helpful to show you where to take this out. So obviously the starter's back up in here, and there's just this hole right here underneath the body and the top of this hose, which that looks like, what is that hose? Looks like it must be something hydraulic coming from the steering. Could be wrong, but if you come out over the top of this hose, that looks like to me the only way to get this out and have it in this orientation. So the long lobe of the starter's on the right and the short is over here and the gear is up on top. So just wanted to show you that real quick. So out with the old and in with the new. So obviously the old, and something about this was getting bound up and wasn't coming out. So we got the old one off, and I mentioned, you know, looking at the ends of the bolts here and that kind of stuff, and you can kind of compare the two. Now you can see where these line up, so the tabs are going to snap back in, and where on the end of this, how that has that gap where I had to actually bend this one out because in shipping it got bent in. And then this connector on the top here, so between the plastic connector here and the other one, they're identical, the exact same body stamp. And then the top here where that cable's going to bolt on with that nut, that's the 12. And I mentioned taking that bracket off earlier. So here's the bracket, and that was like this. Had these two 10mm bolts in it this way, and had a 12mm bolt. So that's the 12 and these are the 10s. And so I looked up torque specs, which I mentioned I was going to look up, and the torque specs for the two bigger bolts are actually 33 foot-pounds. The torque for the nut on the cable was 7. The torque for the two 10mm bolts was 7, and the torque for the one, so these two were 7, and the torque for this one was, I think, like 12. So that's all the torque specs. So like I said, the next step is going to be just getting the new one back in. That hole that this came out over, I showed you, I was pulling it between from the bottom of the body and that hole. You kind of have to get it through, and then you have to twist it to get the metal tabs on the back not to interfere. So I just twisted it like 90 degrees clockwise, and it came right out. I didn't have to. You could unbolt these, you could undo the bolts on this and take these brackets off, and then you wouldn't have to twist that to get that out, but it came out anyway. So iron tree, hopefully this will last another 150,000 miles. Now there is a little connector on the back end here, and it looks like it almost looks like from the end, it looks like a little flat tab cable would go in there, but it's not used at all. It's included on here too. I don't know if that's like a breather. That might be some kind of like breather for the heat to dissipate or something. I'm not exactly sure, but I think this is ready to go in. Now it's just reverse order. Push this up through that hole, get it up in place, get the cable on, and then get the connector back on, get it a little bit more into place, and then sorry if you didn't see that on camera. So we're gonna get it up into place where we can get the cable on, 7 foot-pounds on that nut, and then you got to slide a little bit further into the hole in the motor, and then that cable can get snapped on. That only goes one way. And then once it's up in, we'll get this top hole bolt done first, like I said, 33 foot-pounds, and then we can snap the little cable on with the little connector that was on there. It's just a little push cable, and then that green connector that was on the side of the cable, that'll get pushed on here, and then we'll get that last bolt tightened up. And as you're pushing this into place, the little it's not an impeller, but whatever you call it, the bendix in here, these teeth will line up. Once you slide it in, they'll just slide into place, and because it's not tight, it can be moved, so it'll just move to where it gets put in place. There's no O-ring or anything on the face of this, so you don't have to look for an O-ring. There's no O-ring on the new one, but that's pretty much it. I mean, they all pretty much look identical. You know, even this part of the stamp of the metal even has the same detail in it. So it's probably just a company that picked up the original stamps and materials from Honda. They probably just bought it out and built it. It's even got the exact same, some of the same details in the body, the way that the metal parts are all stamped out. So we're just going to get the new one bolted up, and once we get it bolted in, I'll just show you a little picture of getting it in. If I find any more tips or tricks to get the new one in, I'll show you, and then we'll turn it over and see how she starts. So we're all done now, but that was absolutely brutal. My arms are all chopped to pieces. There is not much room in there at all. You got to come in from so many different angles to try to get the bolts in and out. I got the starter out. That wasn't much of a problem. I mean, it's all things considered, but when I went to go and install the new starter, the top bolt, the one that's between the airbox and the top of the starter, actually cross-threaded, and I had to take the starter out. I left the cables attached, but I took the starter out and had to realign the bolt and get the bolt started without the starter in, and then pull the bolt back out, and then put the starter back in place, and then get the top bolt started with the starter in place. And yeah, it was a lot of work. I think this was like from start to finish, including stop it to eat and stopping for the kids a couple times, it was about 6 hours. I can't imagine, other than just having a lift or having a way to get the car up higher off the ground, I don't know that you could have made the time any shorter. If you don't have the issue with cross-threading the top bolt or having any issues with getting the bolts to rethread to go back in, you could probably cut about at least an hour and a half off of the whole job. But to do a starter and for it to be that difficult is ridiculous. The way that they put the back of the intake right over the top of the starter makes it extremely difficult to get in there. And you know, you could get in there and you get your hand in there and you get up to the bolt where you're trying to get the wrench to turn, and there's no room for the wrench to turn, so you're only turning like 1/8 turns at a time. There's no way to get anything power up in there. I tried a battery operated 3/8 ratchet and couldn't get that up in there. It was extremely difficult to get my torque wrench up in there, and so I would say if if you don't have a shop and you don't have the right tools, I'd say don't even try to do the starter, because it's not an easy job. It seems like it would be. I've done a few on different cars, different makes, and I don't think I've ever had this much trouble with the starter. Obviously, if I hadn't cross-threaded the bolt in the first place, but the weird thing was I had already had the lower bolt was already started. So when I went to put the upper bolt in, I couldn't figure out any way that the housing could have got off on the starter housing so it wouldn't fit up flush. So as soon as I got it flush and got the bolt started, I thought everything was fine. I kept turning, it just kept turning itself, and so I backed it out, and when I backed it out, little bits of aluminum fell out, and I knew that was cross-threaded. Just means that when where the threads are inside the hole and the threads of the screw come together, instead of them lining up with each other like this and threading like that, it threads into the same spot where the thread already was. So the teeth of the bolt actually start tearing out the teeth inside the bolt hole. So I gave you all the specs for the torque specs for all that. Tighten everything down. I understand if you don't use torque specs. The plastic on the bottom where the two 10mm bolts are, I would just be careful with that, because I'm pretty sure that just goes into a couple what are they called? Like a pressed thread, but it's pressed threaded into plastic, so be careful on that. You could strip that out if you put too many foot-pounds of torque on it. We're all done now, so we're putting it up, and as soon as I can get the keys, I'll start it so you can see that it starts now with the new starter in. So we'll do that next. So as you can see, it started right up, and I went ahead and backed out, stopped, turned it off, and then started it again real quick just to show, you know, hopefully we won't have any problems with this starting again. It was in the battery. We could have thrown money at the battery and just replaced that right away and still had the issue with the starter, and then had to replace the starter anyway. So our battery voltage looks good, and the cranking amps are good enough to get the starter turned over. So we're pretty much done with this, and I don't think I have anything else that we're doing on this one. Probably work on doing some spark plugs on our 2012 Dodge Grand Caravan sometime in the future. If you have, you know, if you have anything you'd like to see reviewed, or if you have any questions about anything, you know, I take a lot of time to research something before I go buy it. So if you had something that you're interested in having reviewed, just to find the best price, the best options, put that in the comment section, and I'll take a look and see what I can find for you that would either something household, automotive, tool-wise, doesn't matter. If you want to just throw something in the comment section, I'll take a look at it and see if I can find the best price for you and with the best quality product. So thanks for taking the time to watch. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and we will see you next time.